Hi guys, this is Mrs. Rattan. I am doing this as a supplementary video to the Beloved Book Club, especially if you couldn't participate in the Zoom discussion. This is kind of just an overview of what we seminared and discussed as a group. The first that I really want to look at is some symbols, motifs, or reappearing or repeating symbols or ideas that are very interesting. The first is going back to Foster with the seasons. If you guys are paying attention, it's now winter. And I think it's just interesting to watch how the seasons mirror the characters' emotions. Sometimes it's very positive, sometimes it's very negative. Like, for instance, with Paul D, the winter kind of isolates him. He kind of gets the cold shoulder, from some of the family. Obviously, Beloved is one of them. Later on, there's a really beautiful scene. It's not in this reading, but the three women kind of bond over a snowy day in an icy pond. So pay attention to the seasons. The next thing is color. It's kind of a motif. It's subtle, but there are moments where the characters become fixated on color, especially that quilt that Baby Suggs was fixated on and then Beloved becomes fixated on. And I wonder if color kind of helps represent humanity, or it could represent vitality of life. You know, certain characters, if they feel color or have color in their life, they feel validated or they feel energized. And also, I do think it's an important way to mirror the idea of blacks versus whites and all of the conflicts that were entailed during slavery. The choke tree, which is that horrific scarring on the back of Sethe's back, is finally discussed with Denver's birth story. And I actually really like this image. It's a horrible image because of the brutality, but I really like Amy Denver. She's the white girl that helps deliver baby Denver, because she takes this horrible beating. She acknowledges it's horrible, but yet she compares it to a tree. And obviously, Sethe believed in that comparison and used it when she talked to Paul D about it at the start of the book. So it's kind of a beautiful tree imagery that comes out of such an ugly, horrific scarring. So it's kind of this hopeful image. And then the other thing that's happening a lot, especially in this reading chunk, is a lot of dehumanization. So Paul D had a bit, just like this horse, this thing right here that's kind of holding in his mouth. And we talked about the bit, because a bit is something you use on an animal. A bit, as my seminar group talked about, is also prevents you from speaking. And the ability to speak or communicate, we already know from Chief's perspective in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that's a really important part of humanity. And when you take away a person's ability to speak, that really takes away a lot of their humanity and identity. Some other things is this bit is kind of a breaking point for Paul D. And later on, there's this really good scene right here that you could closely reread. He is talking about Mister, which is actually this thing right here. It's a male chicken rooster, and it's a really heartbreaking scene because he's got the bit in his mouth. He can't talk, and he has absolutely no freedom, not even the freedom to talk or voice or even really to think about who he is, other than he is trapped in this kind of prison, literal and figurative. The reason why I wanted to showcase this passage is I could see this as a cue too. I could see this chunk being pulled and them having you read it and kind of discuss, what do you see? And you really do see this kind of haunting of demasculation and dehumanization that has haunted Paul D and continues to haunt Paul D for most of the book. Going back, the group identified like these breaks in humanity. So the bit is the break in humanity for Paul D. Hal, which is Hal Suggs, that's Sethe's husband, he also has a break in humanity, which is when he witnesses the horrific assault of his wife at the hands of school teacher. So we don't know much about school teacher, but what we can pick up on is he's described as a learned man. He kind of views himself, I think, almost as a scientist or an anthropologist. He's not. He's horrific. But what he ends up doing is, if you haven't picked up on it, he's kind of writing a book about slaves and who they are or what they are. But the problem is his perspective is very dehumanized. And so this whole Sethe's milk being stolen, which has been referenced a couple times, that's what this scene is. Hal is up in the barn and he witnesses it. Sethe did not know that he witnessed it until Paul D revealed it. But some of the boys or the men that were working for school teacher end up assaulting her by taking her milk, her breast milk, which is a very horrific, shattering moment for Hal and also for Sethe, because that's a mother instinct. It's not something that's supposed to be perverted, and these men unfortunately do it. And it just kind of, I think it's also some of the reasons why she has a fractured relationship with her children, because it's just a horrible, horrible thing that she went through. And it actually is just the start of numerous horrible things that happen, from the choke tree incident to her running away, and then later to what happens to Baby Ghost. And so just think about these moments where dehumanization and breaking of humanity. And I know this reading chunk is hard, but the goal is hopefully they're able to move past these breaking points and find some type of peace or resolve or a way to move forward. The other thing is, these were some interesting quotes. We've clearly established that Sethe is a murderer, or she did some type of murder, and we are assuming it's Baby Ghost. We don't know how or why. We just know that it's taken place. But these three quotes, they illustrate community and isolation, which was a really nice discussion point from one of your classmates. Community is important, and if you notice, there's a very bad sense of community right now, like a lack of community. Denver and Sethe have been isolated at 124 in Ohio. They don't have community. Denver was almost reaching community at school, but then she becomes instantly isolated as a cause of this event. And when you have community, you're able to create trust, and you're also able to reflect and understand memories and past and trauma. And what happens is, I think Sethe is trying to understand or at least confront her trauma because Paul D pushes her to do that. Like, for instance, when he reveals Hal is in the barn. However, it's hard for those two characters to bring those two past histories together. And so she is scared. She doesn't know if she can face that. And then he is also scared and therefore locks his memories in a tobacco tin in his chest. And they also don't have that sense of community to help get them through it like they did with Baby Suggs. So moving into a lot of allusions, a lot of biblical allusions. Baby Suggs is a character I actually really like. Some people would argue she's a Christ figure. So if you notice, there's a chapter, it's kind of towards the tail end of this reading chunk, where she has a religion. It's not like an organized, preachy religion like we think of religion traditionally, but she has this therapeutic religion that just helps the community come together and to talk and understand and purge themselves of their trauma. And it seems to work. It seems to be really helpful to the community. But just like Jesus, people get jealous or scared of what a religious figure makes them do or forces them to do or inspires them to do, and they turn on her. And they turn on her during that big communion scene where she does an over-the-top kind of even more gluttonous Christmas party. And for some reason they turn. And I think part of it could be because they're jealous. You know, she's had all of her grandchildren survive and come back. She's has her freedom that was bought generously by her son. Her daughter-in-law has returned, and it's just hard for the community, and they turn on her. And hopefully we see a little bit more of this community and Christ figure. There's a lot of little lines in there that actually reference Bible, like wording or stories. So the loaves and fishes is a very popular Bible story where Jesus was able to keep creating bread and fishes to feed masses of people. And then the four horsemen pop up a little bit later at the very tail end. The four horsemen are actually described in Revelations, which they're like the four different ways the world could be destroyed. Like one of the horsemen is depicted as war. The other one's depicted as famine. And so there's a lot of Bible stuff, and I don't think she's arguing really for an organized religion per se, but I think she's showing a spirituality that's really important for community and is also a good coping or therapy mechanism. Finally, the last thing you can think about is who or what is Beloved? Beloved's character is very confusing because she does things like some people read her as a literal ghost. She's baby ghost manifested. Some people read her as just a really crazy coincidence. Probably one of the best interpretations that came out in today's seminar is she is a representation of the past. And so if you think about her that way, like she's a manifestation of the past, she is going to look and interact differently with each characters. So for Sethe, her past is baby ghost and what happened to her third child. And so Beloved becomes like a pseudo daughter and almost like an infant. To Denver, her past or her trauma is she doesn't have any connection. Her two brothers ran off. She's never had a sister that she can really bond with. So she kind of presents herself that way. For Paul D, which is a little bit more complex, if you go back to this, Paul D, he feels like his identity, his ability to speak, and some might argue even his manhood, because he talks about that later on when he proposes Sethe get pregnant. But his manhood has been taken away. So Beloved becomes kind of a romantic interest or a manifestation in that way. And she becomes more of a past representation in a more sensual way, which is weird, but if you think about that, Beloved can represent numerous pasts, and she represents different things to different people. You will also start to see, and another student brought this up, she talks about where she came from. She describes it as like a horrible closed space, and some people read that as a ship that took the blacks and the slaves and the African trade slavery, like that passage ship. I think it's called the Middle Passage, and some people read it like that. And so if that's true, just think about it. She is carrying the past of all these characters and the entire history of slavery in one kind of manifested identity. That's not a good thing. And we can only imagine how that's going to play out for the rest of the book. So hopefully this helped you or taught you some things. This is definitely some of the things that we talked about today in group seminar, and I really appreciate you working through this complex book. What will happen is it's supposed to challenge you and make you think. I'm also hoping that it might help you prep for the new Q2, especially if they do a more contemporary or a more kind of whimsy or just surrealist piece of literature. And finally, I know this is a tough read, but I do know that it's going to show you hope. I feel like she hits you a lot with some hard stuff. But from here, we got to ask ourselves, how do the characters move forward in their past? Or how do they move forward into hope, into community, out of isolation? And I'd be curious to see what they do and how the ghost either helps or hinders them in that pursuit. Thanks.